First date. Peggy pulled up and parked the car in front of Ron's house. She was really excited for this date. Date? Date? She hadn't had a date since she could last remember. She was so busy with school and with her job, there was just no time for dating. But Ron was special. She had met him the previous weekend at the Morticians Convention. Yes, at the Morticians Convention. His dad and her dad were both morticians, and those two young people were just drawn to each other just like fire and butterflies or mosquitoes. Yes, mosquitoes are better. Anyway, they found that they both had a tremendous passion for cremation, that this would save the earth for the living. And Ron had been busy inventing a smaller crematorium because he felt that every neighborhood should have one, so that when your loved one was deceased, he would be or she would be taken care of by a friend, someone who knew and respected them rather than a stranger. She already thought he was pretty special. So, after pulling down the visor, checking the mirror for her lipstick, she opened the door of the car and started up the walk. Oh! The door opened before she got halfway up the walk, and there was Ron standing there with a huge grin. They almost ran towards each other and had a big hug. He invited her in. This was a smallish little house in an old neighborhood, but still a cozy place. She looked at the living room and the overstuffed furniture. It looked very comfortable, a place to study, to read, and just to talk. Ron said, "You know, I think we should save the crematorium till after dinner because I don't want the pasta to get overcooked." "That's great," she said, "but I am anxious to learn about your other hobbies." "Ah, yeah, let me show you one." He went across the room and opened what she hadn't noticed was a pocket door, so there was a room behind. And as that door opened, she began to hear shh, 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 and she jumped back. The room was full of terrariums with snakes. She recognized one as poisonous. Yeah, he said, "Peggy, please, don't be nervous. It's okay. They don't get out of their terrariums. They're not going to harm you." "But are they all poisonous?" "Yeah, they're all poisonous. There's a good reason for it, Peggy. Let me tell you why I have them. You see, I milk them. When the laboratories that make the antivenoms get in touch with me that they need fresh venom to make their antivenom, and I milk them and I send them in a special way to the laboratories." Now, he was already up to here in Peggy's esteem. Ooh, he really went up in her esteem then. But he closed the door. "Let's go and have our dinner." She walked into the kitchen. It was a typical older kitchen with older appliances and a checkerboard linoleum floor. But there was a small table, and on it were two of the most glistening white plates she had ever seen. "How do you get your plates to glisten like this?" "Mom's old Italian trick. They're brushed with olive oil." "Oh," she said, "that's a great idea." "Yes, and I have actually helped put garlic in the olive oil so it will enhance the flavor of the pasta." He brought out the drained pasta and put it on each of their plates, and then he put there his mom's special pasta sauce. They both mixed it up and twirled it around on their forks. Oh my goodness, this is the best pasta I've ever tasted, Ron. I bet this is a very guarded family recipe. You bet. You bet. We guard this one with our lives, but we share the joy of eating it. Well, they had some talk during dinner, and towards the end, she looked over at this little table. She'd been noticing it. It was a small table in the corner with a lamp and a chair and a book and an old, funny-looking camera. What's the camera for? Is that just decoration? No, I like to do portrait photography, and you know I like to develop the pictures in my own darkroom, which is upstairs. I like to develop the pictures. It's more personal. I get to feel more personal about the person whose picture I'm doing. Well, as they began eating the Italian ice, she began feeling a little uneasy in her stomach. Oh no, please. I don't want to have to go to the bathroom and be a long time and everything will be so obvious. Come on, just be okay. Now, he said, it's time to show you my most important hobby. He went across to the far wall on the dining room, and if it wasn't another pocket door, he opened it up, and there were chairs hanging on the wall in neat order. 10, 11, 12 of them. And on the bottom of each chair was a small box. She went over and looked. What is this? And he said, my dear, those are the cremains of the other ladies that have come here for dinner. We have taken good care of them, and those are the very chairs they sat in. What? Darkness was covering her mind. Her thoughts were banging together like rocks without making connections. And he finally said, now, Peggy, you are special. I love you, Peggy. You are my soulmate. And your cremains will not go on this wall. Your cremains will go under my chair, and someday mine will be together with yours forever. What are you saying? She looked again at the boxes, and on each one there was a picture of a girl, horrified and in pain. Oh, please, I'm so sorry, Peggy. I really tried to make a concoction of the venoms that I mixed with the olive oil that would make a painless transition for you. I'm sorry I didn't succeed. I'll keep working on that, though. Her thoughts finally came together. She spun and looked at him in horror.
December 26th, 2006, was a night I will never forget. I had only been married 3 days, and my lovely wife Teresa and I were leaving Utah on our way over the Sierra Nevada mountains to the warm beaches of Carmel, California, where we looked forward to a lavish, light honeymoon. However, in order to get there in the dead of late night December, we had to cross the very rugged, very snowy Sierra Nevadas. As we were going up higher and higher, I looked forward and could barely see some 6 feet in front of our car as the blizzard flurried upon us. I passed a sign that said, "Donner's Pass, next 5 miles." Now, the fact that I was hungry might have stirred these thoughts, but I couldn't help but think about the starving Donners many, many years ago, ravenous, led to do terrible things in desperation in these mountains. I wondered if their ghosts still haunted it. Well, as we drove, all I could hear was the sound of the motor. Teresa and I had fallen dead silent. The roads were so thin, so narrow, so icy. Suddenly, we saw flashing lights up ahead. We were pulled over by a police vehicle. A man came, braving the blizzard, knocked on my window. I rolled it down, and he said, "You can't pass here unless you have chains. You can get your own, and we'll sell them to you for $40. Well, I rolled my eyes, but I had no choice, so I said, "Okay, I'll buy the stupid chains." I got out, and for another $20, I could have had somebody install it for me, but I thought, how hard could it be? Well, the answer was extremely hard. As I'd only been married 3 days, I still had every intention of being a knight in shining armor for my lady, so I got out there, braved the snow, and tried my hardest to connect these chains. But it was way harder than I imagined. It didn't really stretch around the tire, and with the ice, cold, chilling snow falling on my neck, it was misery. So, finagling it a little bit, it was nice that Teresa couldn't see that I was doing things wrong and tell me that, so I decided this was good enough. I attached this there, that there, called it good. Got back in the car, and we continued to drive in silence. We drove higher, and I was determined to say that this must be the summit. But every summit we reached, there was always another higher summit. Finally, we got over the mountain. The snow was still pouring down. The blizzard was so thick, our eyes were glued on the headlights in front of us. And it seemed that we were starting to skid just a little bit. But luckily, we had chains, and truth be told, I was grateful for them. As we drove on in silence, thinking of ravenous stomachs, thinking of silence, thinking of falling off mountains to our deaths, we heard a rattling. The rattling turned into a clanking. "What's that?" Teresa asked. "I don't know," I lied. The clanking turned into a pounding, and then silence. Just as I was about to sigh with relief, suddenly I realized I could not turn the steering wheel. The car was skidding, and though the roads veered, I tried to veer with it. We went right off the edge. Vertigo sank into my stomach like never before with this sick feeling as we looked down. Branches were whipping upon us. We were tearing right through bushes and branches, and now, we smashed right into 6 feet of snow. We were stuck. Though thankful to be alive, hearts pounding, we looked out. I said, "All right, you stay here. I'll scope out the situation." No sooner did I open my car door than I sank right into the snow. I looked up at the huge hill which we had descended. You could see our tracks coming straight down. There was no way. I tried to descend, but I just slipped every time. It was too steep, too deep. So I said, "Look, there's no sense in both of us going. They're going to come looking for us, and somebody needs to stay here and talk to them. You stay here in the warmth. We'll leave the heater on. I'll find a way up the hill, and I'll flag somebody down." So that's what I did. Following the hill, I walked along through this gully. I tried and tried again to get up, but I just couldn't do it. What felt like a half hour later, it was hard to say because it was just me on the mountainside. I looked up to see if there was any headlights passing. I didn't see anything. I couldn't hear anything. I just continued tromping through the snow. I looked up, but there wasn't even a star. There was just the icy blackness and the white glowing snow beneath my feet. I could hear the crunching sound of the snow beneath me. At one point, I thought I heard someone else crunching. I looked around, but there was nothing to see. So I kept on walking. Crunch, crunch, crunch. I heard it again. Again, I looked around, but there was no one there. Of course, there was no one there. No one could survive in these conditions, which is why I was going for help. So I continued walking. Crunch, crunch, crunch. And then I heard it. I stopped, And though I could hear through the throbbing of my pounding heart in my ears, there was another sound. Crunch, crunch, crunch. I stopped and I looked in the distance, and there was a silhouette of a man I could barely make out from the glow of the snow. "Hey!" I shouted. "Hey, over here! Can you help us? We drove off the side of the mountain." But apparently he didn't hear me. He just stood there. So I walked closer to him. Crunch, crunch. "Hello, can you help us? Can you hear me?" Still, he just stood there. I got even closer. I could make out the silhouette of a cowboy hat, this tall figure just standing there, so stoic. Only when I could make out the bristles of his beard did I realize he was staring right at me. And I began to wonder for the first time if this man perhaps was not someone I should approach. "Hello?" And for the first time he spoke. He said, "Ain't nobody here on this here mountain. Ain't nobody here but you and me." At that, I started to back up. I saw that he was bending down and holding something in his hand. He was brushing it against the snow. It was a broom. He was erasing my footprints. At that, I ran. My heart was pounding. I kept to the side of this hill in the gully. It started to slope up gradually. I must have run for a half mile. Every time I looked back, he was gone. And yet I still kept running. I ran until I was out of breath. And finally, the hill was sloping up. I was struggling. I was pulling hordes of snow. I got higher and higher. And just when I was reaching the top, I finally saw a headlight glimmering through the trees. I knew that hope was near. And as one of those headlights passed, I saw another dark silhouette. I saw the silhouette of a cowboy hat. Impossibly, the man was standing there above me, looking down. "Ain't nobody here on this here mountain," he said a little louder, "but you and me." At that, I tumbled down. I retraced my steps, and I sprinted down into the gully. Though my footprints were gone, I still clung to the side of that mountain, and I ran and ran, falling and tripping into the snow. I didn't care about the icy cold. I got back up and continued running. I ran, and as I ran, I thought, what did he mean? No one is here but me and him. He didn't know about my wife, did he? I prayed to God that he didn't. I ran even faster with more determination, wondering if I had gotten lost. And just when I was determined and certain that I was going to freeze to death, I could see glimmering lights of a taillight in the distance, red, shining through the snow, like blood dripping into it. I ran to that car, and there it was. But my stomach sank as I saw that the passenger door was wide open, and Teresa was gone. I looked around for footsteps, but there was none. Nothing. No one but me and a dark silhouette. The man was there. I don't know how, but he was there. Some 20 yards away. Getting closer, stepping through the snow, he shouted, "Ain't nobody here on this here mountain. Ain't nobody here." I slammed the door as I climbed inside of it. The car was still on. I put it into reverse. I slammed on the gas pedal, but the wheels only spun and spun. There was nothing I could do. Rolling up every window, locking every door, I tried. As he shouted, "But you and me." Suddenly a hand burst through the glass, and I sat up screaming. As I looked forward, I could see city lights in the distance. I looked to my side. The passenger window was no longer broken. Next to me was my wife, sleeping beneath a huge pile of blankets up to her hair. She looked so warm and cozy. I was dry and warm. I remembered that we made it down the mountain and that we'd pulled the car at a rest stop where we were spending the night because we were too cheap for a hotel. I looked around. We were safe in the city. But I couldn't sleep. Starting the car, I just started driving, my eyes glued on the road. My nerves were shot. I could hear Teresa in a sleepy voice saying, What are you doing? Are you okay? I had a terrible nightmare, I said. We were still up on the mountain, and everywhere I went, there was this guy following me. Look, I know this sounds crazy. I glanced in the back. But there's this pile of blankets back there. Would you just humor me and check under it? Because I just feel really creeped out right now. Just want to make sure there's no one else in the car. So, as my eyes were glued on the road, I could hear her reaching back. She lifted up the blankets. She said, "There's nothing there. You don't need to worry. There's absolutely no one here but you and me."
To this day, I still don't know what happened. 4th grade. I was finally in 4th grade, and I got to go on the school campout. In our school, we all got to go on a campout down to the San Rafael Swell down in southern Utah. So I was so excited to finally get to go. So I was on a school bus with the leather seat, you know, like the leather chairs in a school bus. I remember I had my hands on the back of the seat, and it was me and my 2 best friends. It was Kyle and Anthony, and we were so excited to go on this campout. So we were bouncing down a dirt road, hands on the leather seat, and I looked out the window, and all I could see was sagebrush, sagebrush, sagebrush. It's Utah. And I looked, but then suddenly, way in the distance, I saw a lone cottonwood tree, a big, gnarly, snaggly one, kind of like this. And I didn't really think much of it. We were so excited to be on this camping trip. And the bus pulls up right next to this cottonwood tree. We stop. And we're so excited. We run down the aisle of the school bus and step down the stairs and into the hot, dry desert sand. And I felt this odd feeling down in the pit of my stomach. But I shook it off real quick because I was so excited to be camping. And we all rushed around to try to find where the best tent spot was. And as you all know, the best tent spot is where the ground is the softest. So we ran around looking, and the softest by far sand was right beneath the cottonwood tree. It was real fluffy and soft and light. So of course, Anthony and Kyle got that spot. So they set their tent up there, and I had to go find another more rocky spot. And we spent the rest of the day, had a great time, and that evening, we all sat around the campfire, and we wanted to be the ones to stay up the latest because we were in 4th grade and we thought we were really cool. So we even stayed up later than the teacher. So our classmates started to go off to their tents one by one until the teacher finally stood up and went to bed. So then it was just me, Kyle, and Anthony. Oh, we were so cool. And then finally, I wanted to be the one to stay up the latest. So finally, Anthony was beat. He said, "I'm going to bed." So he stood up and left the fire and went to his tent, which was right under the cottonwood tree. And it was one of those dome tents, you know, the kind that only have one door going in and out. He goes over to his tent and zip, goes inside, zip. So then it was up to me and Kyle, who was going to be up the latest. And I was determined it was going to be me. So we sat by the fire. And then suddenly, over beneath the cottonwood tree where the dirt was the softest, Anthony's tent started to shake slightly. I thought maybe it was a trick of the firelight, maybe, so I elbowed Kyle. "Do you see that?" "Shh, shh, 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 shh." So we kind of stand up. He had gone to bed a while ago, so we kind of go over closer to the tent and look closer. And it started to shake more. Shh, 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 shh. And we're like, Anthony, what's going on in there? We didn't want to wake up the teacher, and no response. Shh, shh, shh. Started shaking more and more, and there was only one door going in and out, and we would have seen him leave, so he was still inside. Shh, 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 shh. And Kyle's finally like, "Anthony, what is going on?" Zip, and looks inside. Anthony was gone. Just a sleeping bag rumpled, and several long, raking tears in the bottom of the tent, and you could see the soft sand through the tears in the bottom of the tent, and no sign of Anthony. So we started looking around. Anthony, 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 this is not funny. Where are you? And we started looking wider and expanding our search until finally we had to wake up the teacher. We don't know where Anthony is. So she looked, kind of expanding her search wider around the tent. Finally had to wake up all the kids and gather them to get a head count and call search and rescue. And I remember it was the longest night. We all sat waiting for Anthony, and search and rescue came in, looked, they expanded the circle. I don't know what happened further because we all got pushed back on the bus and sent back home. And hours turned into days, no sign. Days turned into weeks, turned into months. I never saw Anthony again. Fast forward 20 years. I'm sitting in an anthropology class at BYU. I love learning about different cultures, and I really enjoy this class. And the teacher gets up and says, hey, there's an opportunity for a field trip. There's this really awesome archaeological dig down in southern Utah, and you guys are welcome to come check it out. There's some cool things that we've never seen before. And I thought that sounded pretty cool, a chance to go on a field trip, so I volunteered. So once again, I was on a school bus. You know, the leather back of a school bus, hands on, and I was bouncing down a dirt road. And I look out the window, and all I can see is sagebrush, sagebrush, sagebrush. But in the distance, I saw a cottonwood tree, a particularly scraggly, gnarly cottonwood tree. And I got this feeling down low in my stomach. Something was off, a feeling I hadn't felt in 20 years. So I go and I ask the teacher, tell me what exactly it is with this archaeological dig. What's going on? She's like, oh, I'll show you when we get there. It's something really cool that we haven't seen before. So the bus, I thought, no way, pulls up right next to the cottonwood tree, stops. Once again, I'm walking down an aisle, stepping down into the hot, dry desert sand. Shaking my head, I look around the school bus, and sure enough, these little pegs were marking off where the archaeological dig was, right under the cottonwood tree where the dirt and the sand was the softest, in exactly the size and shape of a tent. I finally say, you gotta tell me what it is about this dig. She says, this archaeological dig is one of the shallowest digs we have ever seen, where the skeleton is this well preserved. So I walk over and look into where the dirt was carefully brushed away, and right where a tent would have been was a skeleton. Like this, with fingers outstretched, right beneath 20 years ago, where Anthony would have been sleeping. And next to the skeleton was a smaller skeleton, about 4th grade. I said, tell me more about this dig. And she says, what's crazy about this is that the big skeleton, the adult skeleton, is hundreds of years earlier than the small skeleton. So next time you're out camping and you're in a tent laying on the ground and you feel that lump under your back, is it a rock? Is it a root? Or is it a skeleton finger?
This story is called Tunnel Run. You want me to do what? Corwin was a 12-year-old bully of the neighborhood, and 13-year-old Nancy had the nerve to call for his help. What do you want me to do? My brother's missing. He went through that tunnel to the construction site, and he's been missing for hours. If you'll find him, I will give you my new bike. What do I want with a stupid girl's bike? Your sister can have it. My sister's pretty good in telling everything I want to do. If I give her a new bike, I'll buy her loyalty. All right, I'll look for your brother. Now, if you don't find my brother, you have to promise to never bully anyone in this neighborhood again. Now, it's important for a bully to be a man and a guy of his word. If I tell someone I'm going to meet them behind the high school or the elementary to kind of teach them a lesson, I'm a guy of my word. I can't break my word once I give it. If you don't find my brother and bring him back, you can't harass us anymore in the neighborhood. I do need to buy my sister's loyalty. All right. So, there's a big construction site, and there's a few trees in the middle, a fence around the construction site, and a metal tunnel to get through to the construction site. Come on, Peep Squeak. Now, see, my sidekick, I just call him Peep, but it's for Peep Squeak. Well, I don't want to go. Too bad. So we start crawling through the tunnel. It's cold and dark, because of course she's going to choose a nighttime adventure to go to the other side, and all I have is a flashlight that she gave me. And even then, the battery's not the best. As I crawl through the tunnel, it's wet and damp. The parts of the tunnel are not completely together. There's sections that are open to the outside. And as we pass through one section of the tunnel to another section of the tunnel, water is drizzling down through the breaks. And Peep Squeak all of a sudden squeals, "Something bit me, something bit me!" And he whams into behind me, and I say, "Get behind me." And he says, I'm bleeding, something grabbed me, something bit me." Oh, chill. We continue through the tunnel. And as we go toward another break, there is a tunnel that has clay built around the circumference of the tunnel, of where I can barely squeeze through, and Peep Squeak, being fatter than I am, has a harder time, but we finally get through. We find bones of animals scattered at different spots of the tunnel. And as we go to another intersection, something red is drizzling from the top and going down the sides. It can't be blood. But as I rub my finger against it and smell the metallic aroma, it's real blood. We continue on, and finally, as we get to the end, there is a deep hole in the tunnel, and I think someone had to break through the bottom ring of the tunnel to get to the dirt, and we have a challenge time to get past that deep pit. As we finally climb at the end of the tunnel, we look up and climb out, and there are 3 kids strung at the top of the tree. Their arms are longer than they should be in their sleeves. And a piece of hair is laying in the ground covered by dirt. They had been killed. We squeal and we head for that fence, climb over the fence and run away. Only later does the 3 kids that were supposed to be dead in the tree meet together with the sister. And they're laughing because now they know that their bully will no longer bother them. What was the bite of Peep Squeak's leg but a tool? And the blood on the mannequin arms was simply ketchup. And that's the story of how they stopped a bully from harassing the neighborhood. Thank you.
All right. So there I was, outside of an old pawn shop. It was raining really hard outside, and the date was October 26th. Now, why is that date significant, and why was I standing outside in the middle of a thunderstorm? Well, apart from that being today's date, it was also my wife's birthday. And right in the display of this old pawn shop was this beautiful silk kimono, which is a Japanese robe, right? A robe made in Japan. And I just thought to myself, because I had seen one earlier that week, this would look beautiful on my wife. Just as I was about to step inside and go and buy the kimono, I felt this eerie presence over my shoulder, like someone was watching me. So I began to look in the direction of this eerie presence, and sure enough, right next to me was this homeless guy staring straight at me. Did I jump back in fear and have my heart pounding 100 miles an hour? Who wouldn't? So I jumped back and I was like, oh. And I said to this man what any person would have said when looked upon a creepy stranger in the middle of a thunderstorm. I said, hello, can I help you? And he says to me, no, but I can help you. And he reaches into his pocket to pull what I could only assume was a knife. And I'm like, whoa, look, man, take it easy. And he pulls out a cigarette. And he holds it in his hands and he looks at me and he says, oh, this'll kill you all right, but not that quickly. And he puts it in his mouth and he reaches into his pocket again, and this time he does pull out a knife. And I'm like, all right, look, man, I don't have anything. I got a wife. And he cuts me off and he says, that's what they all say. Now shut up, this'll only take a second. And I said, that's what they all say. I didn't say that out loud, but then I hear this, and I was pretty certain that he sliced my kidneys. But instead, he reaches behind me and he pulls out this price tag. And then he drops it to the floor, and then he begins looking at the window at this Japanese kimono. Once my heart settled again, and I kind of started looking into the window again with him, and he asks me, now what would interest you in a piece of fine Japanese clothing? And I said, well, I want to get one for my wife. And he says, now son, I can think off the top of my head 2 reasons why you do not want that there robe. I said, okay, what's the first one? And he says, that there is a Fariso Day, which by the late 1600s was the style of robe that was only worn by single women. Now, does that match the description of your wife? I said, no. I'll take your word for it. What's the second reason? And he says, it's quite possible that if your wife wears that robe, you will not see her the very next day. I said, why not? And then he begins to relate to me this Japanese folktale. Apparently, several hundred years ago, in Okinawa, Japan, there was this young maiden who was fair and beautiful to look upon. And she was walking through town, and she happened to catch a glance of this young samurai warrior. And he was walking through, and he walked off, and she said to herself, I really want to see if I can capture his attention. The young warrior was wearing this silk outfit, and he bore on the front of it this white flower crest. So, figuring that if she made some kind of attire that was very similar to what he was wearing, maybe he would stop one day and look at her. So she went and had this beautiful silk robe made, and it bore the white flower crest symbol on the front. So she goes walking through town in the hopes of capturing his attention one day, and to her awful dismay, she doesn't find him. And a couple days turn to weeks, and a couple weeks turn to a month. And soon she is just overcome with despair that she goes home and she finds herself consumed. And ultimately, that consumption gives way to sickness, and that sickness gives way to death. Now, it was the tradition that when they found very beautiful items like the silk robe that she was wearing, they would donate it to the local Buddhist temple, and that Buddhist temple would then resell it to the public. So sure enough, the Buddhist temple resold that robe to the public, and it was bought by another fair young maiden. And she put on the robe, and then within a couple of hours of putting on the robe, she starts to have visions and hallucinations of a young Japanese warrior. And with those visions and hallucinations, she feels this longing to be with him to the point that she develops a sickness. And later on that night passes away. The robe is then redonated to the Buddhist temple, who then resells it again. And can you guess who buys it the next time? A fair young maiden who, within hours of putting it on, develops this longing for a young Japanese warrior, a samurai warrior, which gives way to consumption, which gives way to sickness, which gives way to death. This time, when the Buddhist temple receives the robe, the priest is pretty suspicious, and he suspects that there's evil at work there. So this time, instead of reselling it to the public, he orders the robe to be burned. So this fire is started on the first floor of the temple, and the robe is thrown onto the fire. Within seconds of the robe hitting the flames, the embers start to dance in a very suspicious way. And then, out of nowhere, this gust of wind comes and blows the embers downhill on the neighboring houses, and the entire town catches fire. So I turned to this homeless man. I'm like, why are you telling me this? And he says, because the story is true. And there's one detail that was missed from the story. I said, okay, first of all, how do you know the story is true? And he says, the love of my life was the fourth victim. And I know it's true because that robe had a white crest. And then he points to the window. And sure enough, that robe had a white crest on it. And he says, I wouldn't buy it if I were you. But to my utter surprise, the response that he gave me afterwards was not what I expected. He gave me this eerie smile, to which I then walked away. It was really creepy. Now that's what got me walking away from him in the first place. What kept me walking away was that I remembered the robe I had seen earlier that week that I said to myself, this would look great on my wife, was being worn by my mother. So I called my mom and I said, Mom, that robe that you were wearing earlier this week, where did you get that from? And to my utter surprise, she says that, well, honey, I was just kind of standing there and a kind old man gave it to me. And he said, this would look great on you. And I said, what did this man look like? And she gives the description of the old man that I was just talking to. And then I said, Mom, does that robe have a white flower crest on the front of it? This is really important. You've got to tell me if that's what it has. And she says, oh yeah, honey, that was one of my favorite parts of the robe. Now, completely in utter shock, I look back and the homeless guy is nowhere to be seen. And then I look back at the window display and the robe that I was looking at is gone. And within a week, there had been reports in the surrounding area, rumors of what someone was calling himself the kimono killer. Thank you.
In dreams, I can see the rolling green hills of home. I can smell the sea salt of the coastline, I could feel Mariah's kisses on my face. It starts to rain. The moonlight glistens off our wet faces. I could feel the rain landing on the top of my head, rolling down my hair, and pooling at the back of my head, and pooling at the back of my head, and pooling at the back of my head. I wake up. I'm laying on a gurney. My wrists are restrained. I see a blurry figure leave the curtain partition that I'm inside of. I lazily roll my head over to the side, and I see a surgical tray with crimson scalpels on it. I roll my head back. The headrest of my gurney is wet. What happened to me? Last night, I was standing on top of a pile of debris, fire burning all around me in the middle of the city square. The revolution had begun, and I was the centerpiece of it. I lifted my fist up in the air, the words "fight" emblazoned down on my arm. I was the message, the centerpiece of this revolution, and I was the man to do it. I was a natural charmer. I was the embodiment of force of will, and I had the gumption to gather a crew of people who would topple the empire. The militia came on cue. There was no reason to put up a fight. We had done our job, and our resistance was futile. They put us in the back of military caravans, and while we were riding, we looked at each other, pride in our eyes, satisfaction in our hearts. Our lives had meant something. We were prepared to die. The caravan stopped. The doors opened. We gave each other one last look. I raised my fight arm one more time, and we walked out to a hospital. It's not where we expected to go. Our resolve was wavering a little bit. Perhaps they were going to torture us first, but they would not break us. We had already accomplished our work. They led us to the basement of the hospital complex, where there were hundreds of curtained-off partitions like little cubicles. We were each led into one. I was last, at the very back, and they put me down in this gurney and restrained my wrists and my ankles. And then they left us there for several hours. Probably to get us nervous, but it wouldn't work. We joked at first. We sang the songs of freedom and revolution till we thought the hospital would shake to the ground. We shouted, "Revolution! Revolution!" And then we laughed ourselves silly when Joffrey peed himself and a rat went into his partition. It's wonderful. But then several more hours passed. The lights started to flicker in the basement. People stopped answering when their names were called. And we could hear the squeaky wheels of a metal trolley going down the aisle. I looked over, and through the curtain, I could see the silhouette of one of my comrades laying on their gurney, their head, body, their feet poking up at the end. And then I looked a little further, and I could see just barely the silhouette of another comrade, a second curtain down. And I hear the trolley has stopped in front of that one. And turning my head as much as I can, it's the only movement I have, I could see two figures walking into that far curtain, their silhouettes. One shorter and fatter, one thinner and taller. The fat one goes over to the front and sits at the head of the gurney. I heard something. I couldn't quite hear what he said, but it was a tool was handed to him, and I heard and stopped. Another mumble. Oh. This time the tall figure handed a very thin silhouette to the one sitting at the head of the gurney. He handled it, lifted it high, and then the thin silhouette met the head of my comrade laying on the gurney. And this is when I started to ask myself the questions I'd been avoiding. What are they doing to us here? I became acutely aware of how tight my restraints were at that moment. I yanked my wrists, my ankles, until they were bloodied and bruised. I couldn't escape. The squeaking of the trolley continued. The figures had finished at that curtain and now were in the curtain right next to me. I saw the same small, stomp figure go to the top of and sit at the head of the gurney, and the tall figure stand in the middle. And this time I heard the first word. Razor. Bzzz. And I saw the small tools stroking back and forth on the head of the silhouette through the curtain. And then it stopped, and I wondered, why are they shaving us? This is probably one of those prison tactics where they strip you of their identity so they can control you. That won't work on me. Then I couldn't quite make out the second word again. But I saw that same thin silhouette be handed to the figure. This time my comrades seemed to have known what was coming. I saw his silhouette start to shake, and I heard him screaming. But then something was put on top of his mouth, and he stilled. And then that thin silhouette met at the top of his head. I started to panic. I only had so much time before it was my turn, and I still didn't know what was happening to us here, or why they brought us here in the first place instead of just killing us. But I knew I couldn't solve this with how anxious and panicked I was feeling. My heart was pounding so loud, my ears were throbbing. So I tried to think of something to make myself relax, and then maybe I could think of a plan. So I thought of the rolling green hills of home. I thought of the smell of the sea salt of the coastline. I thought of Mariah's kisses on my face. And that's when the curtain behind me opened, and two figures walked into the room. A panic I had never known took over me at that moment. My body screamed out all the hatred I could muster to try and condemn these figures for what they were doing, but it was to no avail. I couldn't see them, but one figure sat at the head of my gurney, and I could see his hands just on the side of my face with white gloves. Cracked his neck, and he called for a razor. Zzz. I heard that buzzing. I was yanking my wrists into those restraints as hard as I could. It felt like my right hand was about to slip through just a little bit, but I felt the back of my head begin to vibrate. Zzz. And with several strokes from the back all the way to the crown of my head, I was now bald, and I could feel a breeze against my newly shaved scalp. I could feel a little trickle of blood from his rough hands, the rough job he did cutting a mole, and it was rolling down my neck, but I couldn't touch it. The razor stopped. Scalpel, he called for. And I thought, what does he need that for? And I start yanking, I'm pulling my right hand as hard as I can, and then he says, gas. A mask that the tall assistant grabbed was then thrown on my face. And I was calm. There was nothing really to worry about. They rubbed some liquid on my head. It was orange and it smelled strange. I was at peace, and I could see the rolling green hills of home, and I could smell the sea salt of the coastline, and I could feel Mariah's kisses on my face. There was a voice inside me that told me, fight. And the last thing I felt before I fell asleep was a piece of cold metal touching my temple. Back to the present. I hear a and my wrist restraints are released. I sit up. I feel at my shaven head, and I could feel the stitching. There was no bumps. They hadn't put anything in there. My memory was intact, so what had they done? I was anxious, so I tried to think back of my memory to calm down. So I tried to think of the hills with vegetation. But something was off. I tried to think of the smell of salt, but it wasn't working. I tried to think of that girl and the physical contact, but it wasn't working. Ah, the revolutionary is awake. The short figure had come back into the room. I said, "What have you done to me?" Fascinating, isn't it? With just a few precise cuts, and the emotions no longer fire. No indignation, no hatred, no sadness, no revolution. I tried to stir some kind of action in myself. I looked down at my wrist and thought of the word fight, and I thought, surely this would rekindle this revolutionary spirit, and I'd be able to fight this man. But when I looked, it's as if it just said the word dispute. I couldn't make myself feel. Unfortunately, the procedure is much more invasive than we would like. Your mind is far too damaged for any complex labor, so you'll just be good for menial labor for the rest of your life, starting with cleaning up that horrible display you made in the town square yesterday. And I thought this would end the revolution. If they saw its leader as a mindless slave, cleaning up, it would all be over. I looked over at the crimson scalpels on the surgical tray and tried to ignite some passion in myself, tell my mind a story, to burn a fire inside, to make me attack this man and to save the revolution. But I didn't feel like it. There didn't seem to be a good reason to anymore. So when he said, "You will begin your labors," I said, "Yes, sir."